I'm Marty O'Donnell, and I'm a composer and an audio director, and I've done commercials and film and games for the last 17 years. How I got into game audio is interesting. I think I always played games. I always loved games. I started playing computer games even in the 70s. But games were, for me, what I could play on the Nintendo systems and maybe some text adventure games on my computer. In 1993, I met a kid. He was 18 years old and he worked for a company in Spokane. And he was a friend of, he was the son of a friend of mine. And he came over to my house and he showed me this beta version of a very cool computer game called Myst. So I played Myst, the beta version, and I heard the sound design and the music and what they were doing, and I thought, oh, this is exactly what I want to do when it comes to audio in games. So instead of having the sort of incessant music that played in the Nintendo games, which I enjoyed, I loved it, but I never was attracted by the fidelity of the sound or the music itself necessarily. I saw that games now were moving into an area that had high fidelity, that had voice acting, that had recorded music, that actually had real sound design. And I decided at that moment I wanted to stop doing commercials and films and see if I could get into games. And that's what I did. You know, I think the interesting thing for me coming from film and television was that sound design and music and mixing were all really important to film and commercials. And I knew all those disciplines. And in the game world, I felt like some of these things weren't really happening, or maybe I just didn't even know what the conventions were. So when I started working on games, the first game I did was the sequel to Myst, which was Riven. And it had, the implementation was beautiful ambient sound effects tracks that were long and would loop. And at the same time, I started working with Bungie in Chicago on a game called Myth: The Fallen Lords. And they had a completely different kind of sound implementation. Everything had to be very short and compact. But they had this ability to take small loops and randomize them and have multiple layers of things playing back. And I remember walking around with my wife outside one day, and I was just listening to the ambience of on our little walk, and I could hear if there was a layer of wind that would just randomly change, and I would hear a dog bark, and then I would hear a crow caw. And I thought, well, if I do it in a way that's predictable, people will get used to that. They'll hear the crow caw, then the dog bark, and then the wind blow. And when it loops back around, they'll hear that same thing again. And that repetition is very obvious. So when I talked to the Bungie guys, I said, can I do a layer of random winds that just play in random order? They said, yeah. And I said, can I just then throw randomly with random intervals of time, crow caw and dog bark? And they're like, yeah, that's easy. And I'm like, oh, well, then that's going to make it, I'll never know how it's going to play back. And my ears will never pick up on the repetition. And you can use way less material. You don't need as much recorded material. But if you are controlling and randomizing the playback, you end up sounding like reality. And that was the beginning. That even applied to music and everything else we did. Voiceover, random lines of dialogue, so they wouldn't always play the same thing over and over again. So as soon as I saw how powerful that was, randomizing short snippets of audio, it just became such a powerful tool that we just kept developing that and making it more and more effective over the years at Bungie. Well, I started pretty full-time doing game audio. Mike Salvatore and I had a company in Chicago that did film and commercial music. And when I decided to get into games, I had to sort of drag Mike along with me. He wasn't that interested in doing games. He stayed doing commercials, but we were still partners. But we did Riven, Myth, Septerra Core, Oni, and then we started working on this new thing called Halo. And we knew Halo was going to be amazing. But it wasn't until we were purchased by Microsoft and we realized we were going to be a launch title for the Xbox, the first Xbox, and we were purchased in 2000. And the thing that excited me the most about the Xbox was that there was going to be real-time 5.1 surround sound. And this, to me, was sort of the holy grail. It was a technological leap for the actual sound playback. Sound and music playback in games in real-time surround was spectacular. And I was going to do anything to catch that train. So we came out to Microsoft. Mike stayed in Chicago. I came out to Microsoft. I knew Brian Schmidt already. We were both Chicago boys. And Brian was embedded in Microsoft, making sure that the Dolby chip was in there and the HRTF chip was in there. And it was a really fun time because the audio technology for the home theater, you were finally going to have a game that played not on your desktop with little Twinkie speakers, but on your home theater, your big TV, your home theater speakers. And I felt like, okay, we can actually compete from an audio fidelity standpoint with the movies that people are watching on their home theaters. And so I wanted to be there at the beginning. It was a great opportunity. Well, actually, I think there are two sides to successful game audio, in my opinion. And writing good music is paramount. You have to be able to write music that is likable or appropriate or memorable. You have to know how to write good music, first of all. But that only gets you so far. That's like halfway there. And then the implementation side, how it plays back, how your sound design, how your music plays back for the player, what their experience is the other 50%. So the absolute best sound design, the absolute best music that's implemented poorly is a failure. And if you have really great implementation, but the music is boring or the sound design is not professional, that's a failure too. So it's 50-50 for me. It's funny, for me, I played these games and I actually thought one of the aesthetic problems with a lot of games was there was this habit of having wall-to-wall music. And even early films, when they started putting music in films, they would score everything. Music was a constant presence in the film. And composers for film finally learned, and I think audiences finally got more excited about films that had music that scored the action and then really good sound design that would take over. So the music had more power when it wasn't being used all the time. So that was my first approach, was music shouldn't be playing all the time. And then if you do have music that's more ambient and maybe is malleable, so it can stretch based on how long someone's playing an encounter or wandering in the forest or whatever it might be, you still have to have some element that says, look, if this person's been listening to this piece, no matter how random and how cool it's being played back, after 3-4 minutes, it starts to just become background wallpaper. So that's why I said I need one final switch that keeps track of how long something is, called the bored now switch. And as soon as I think someone's going to be bored with this music, we get out of it. And, no one really argued with me on that. They trusted that I knew what I was talking about. There were times when I would notice that some people would struggle with a certain encounter and it took them too long to get to the climax. And at that point, suddenly there was no music. My father is one of them who kept saying, well, where's the music? And I'm like, Dad, you're playing so badly that the board now switch has kicked in. So you don't get music. You have to play better to get the music. So it's funny, it's not a perfect system. It's my own personal, when I'm bored with the music. So it's possible other people would like the music to play longer, but for me, it's like, wow, I don't want to hear this piece anymore. It's gotta go away. And especially if it's a piece of music that is designed to change and adapt to what the player's doing. So there are things that happen and they stair step up or they go back or down or whatever it is. If the player isn't making progress and the music is just sort of in this boring state, you have to figure out a way to get out of that, because my I would say the most important thing for me as a composer and a sound designer in games is that I don't annoy the player. Sounds that are annoying, I think, are worse than just about anything in a game. Yeah, so the iterations of the Xbox, from Xbox One to 360 to Xbox, well, actually, now it's called Xbox One, the first Xbox. The chips got better, the fidelity got better, the sound compression got better. It didn't really make what we were creating from an audio standpoint all that different. We already had a really good aesthetic for creating audio for the gamer and the music, but we had more leeway. We could have higher fidelity, we could have more music, we could have more sound effects, we could have more voices playing simultaneously. So it just took everything we were doing and just kept expanding it. It didn't really give us a sort of a sea change in how we approach things. It just got better and better and easier. And suddenly we almost had unlimited amounts of space to put music in and you know, and surround sound mixes and voice, the number of voice files went from, you know, a couple thousand to tens of, almost hundreds of thousands of files. It's just unbelievable how much content we could put in a game. I think over the last 10 years, we just got better at everything we were doing. It seemed like we were able to do better music, better recordings, hire better actors. Everything just got bigger and better. But the sort of underlying aesthetic of what game audio or what we could do with interactive audio or adaptive audio didn't really change. It just got better and more complex. Today, there's a new thing happening that has to do with head tracking and VR and AR, which is really exciting because it's technology that's allowing us as creators to say, what is the person's experience when we know where their ears are? We know exactly where the audience's ears are in space, in the game. What can we create for them? So 3D audio is actually really coming of age because there's a reason now for 3D audio better than there's ever been before. So that I'm really looking forward to seeing. How does that change the experience of the user? And then what does that do for us from an aesthetic standpoint? What is music? What is sound design? What is dialogue? How does that all work now in a world where we know where the listener's ears are? So doing a game soundtrack is a really interesting proposition because you're taking music that was intended to play back in an adaptive way and basically freeze it into a performance that's only heard one way on a CD. We had done that a few times with The Myth, The Fallen Lords, and Soul Blighter and some other soundtracks. But once we finished Halo, there was a lot of music in Halo, and we wanted to get a soundtrack out as soon as possible. Turned out that a guy in New York had heard the game music. His name is Nile Rodgers, who called Microsoft and then ended up talking to me. We had this great meeting about making a soundtrack to be sold. And that's how the first Halo soundtrack was made. And it also launched his company that has done so many soundtracks now over the years, Something Distribution, Something Music, I think it's called. But it's fun for me to get done with a game, listen to all the music that's been created and say, okay, how do I walk the listener through that experience of playing the game and give them an experience of each individual piece? So I basically take the best stuff, I put it in the best order, the order I like the best, and make a CD out of it or make a listening experience out of it. And we've been able to do that many, many times over, and it's always been really fun. The last few soundtrack CDs, and there was my stomach. All right. The last few soundtrack CDs that we've done, I've actually tried to have the order in the listening order be the same order that you would encounter these pieces if you were playing through the game. So that actually helps give me a reason for putting music in a certain order. When I think about composing for a game, I'm very, very focused on what is the purpose of the music. Sometimes there's music that needs to be done for a trailer or a commercial or some sort of marketing piece. And that music then usually ends up being associated with the game, which means you need to probably have some version of that in the game. But I'm never thinking about the soundtrack album until after the game is done, except for this last time when we did Music of the Spheres, and that was a prequel to Destiny. It was intended to be a prequel to Destiny, so it was a singular music experience of 8 movements that would just give sort of presage the world of Destiny from a musical story standpoint. And that was the first time I actually thought about music as a standalone experience outside the game. You know, when I start thinking about music for a game, it's almost always, number one, music has to have a story that it tells. So music has a beginning, a middle, and an end, and it has some sort of shape that tells us an emotional story. I don't think about the interactive implementation of music until after I've written something that I like, or Mike has written something that I like, or Mike and I together have come up with a piece that tells some sort of a compelling emotional story. And then I start thinking about, okay, how do I just sort of dissemble that piece of music and make it so it can be played back interactively? For me, that's the most successful way to approach it. I'm sure other people have other ways of approaching. I find that if I start thinking ahead of time about how to make something interactive, my music ends up being more boring. I don't know why. Maybe I just get too balled up in the technology of the playback. So for me, and I think Mike too, we both really feel like the best way to start is to write the best music you can write for the purpose that it has. So it needs to have some sort of an emotional story that's being told. And then you can figure out a way to make that adaptive. That's worked really well for me. Wow, yeah. You know, working with Sir Paul McCartney was a dream come true. I was not expecting this at all. It turned out that he was interested in doing something he had never done before, which he does apparently all the time. He had never been in the game music space before. I was able to meet him and explain to him what was different about writing for game music than writing normal music. And he seemed really fascinated by the proposal that he could try that out. What I used when I was talking to him about it was some examples of looping music, and I talked about how music looped. And I also talked about Revolver and Tomorrow Never Knows, because it's filled with these great music concrete tape loops that Paul did, and then with a really strong underlying rhythm section from Ringo. And it made the random loops on top feel like they were meant to be in that order because of Ringo's drumming. So as I was explaining that to him, he was like, yeah, that's cool. And then he went back to his place. I found out that he wanted to work with us. And he immediately said, I just got out my old Brunel tape machine, the actual tape machine that he used on Revolver and Sgt. Pepper to make tape loops. And the first thing he sent me was called a tape loop symphony, where he had just done a zillion tape loops and mashed them up and put them together and just sent me this Pro Tools session filled with loops. And I was like, wow, this is the coolest thing ever, because now I get to I hear all this stuff Paul did, and just like George Martin, I could sort of pick and choose what I wanted to do with it. And Paul was really happy with that arrangement. So he was like, I'll do whatever you ask me to do, and I'll do stuff I think is cool, and I'll send it to you, and you guys decide how you want to work with it. So it was, he didn't do a lot of hands-on, game audio implementation kind of music. He just did music that he thought was, once again, tells a cool emotional story, and then left it up to us to figure out how to work with it, how to put it inside our music. I remember at one point he said, he says, Marty, I really like the way you take my melodies and you just put them into your music and it becomes our music. And I was like, okay, well, how much better can it be than that? So that was great. Well, I actually think collaboration is absolutely the most important thing in game development. And as a composer, I just don't think it's all that smart to be super precious about I have to be the only one to compose the music. I've worked with Mike Salvatore since way back in the day, and it almost always turns out that what we do together is better than what we do by ourselves. He fills in my weaknesses, I fill in his weaknesses. When we work together, something great, well, I think something great usually comes out of it. And I've been able to do that with other composers too. So, and orchestrators, sometimes, I mean, we never get to the point where we haven't basically orchestrated our pieces. But by bringing in an orchestrator to sort of look at what we've done and plus it and make another pass at really perfecting the orchestration, that's been great for us. And the same with engineers. We can do our own engineering, but getting another mixing engineer and getting another mastering engineer, getting more ears involved, always makes the music better. Well, I've been independent again, an independent contractor again, for about a little more than a year, and I haven't really done actual just composing for a game. I might do that, but I'm also interested in, I'm so interested in how an entire game is put together that I've actually, I'm working with a couple other people in the Seattle area who found themselves not at a AAA game studio any longer. And we've decided to start a little, what I would call a veteran indie game company. It's called Highwire Games. And I'll be audio director of that. And so what we're working on, I'll be doing even more than I've done. By the time I left Bungie, there was probably 9 audio people in the audio department. So I was doing a lot of directing of people's creative contribution. But now I'm going to be the only guy at the place, this little game company. And it's exciting to be there again because I'll be composing, directing, sound designing, implementing, doing everything. And I think that's where my heart is. I don't really like writing music and then throwing it over the wall to somebody to decide how to implement something. I don't think that's my strength. Well, what I like about having and returning to a small company that's a little more nimble, and each person who is at the company has to be a triple threat person. We all have to be able to do more than one thing. And I think one of the things I'm leaving behind as Bungie grew from about 25, 30 people when I first started working with them up to almost over 600 people, I found myself spending so much of my time in meetings just to try to get communication going between groups. And you'd still figure out ways of dropping the ball. Like there was some really important group that didn't know something that they needed to know in order to get something done. When you have a small team of 10, 15 people, that just doesn't happen. And yeah, you might not be able to do the giant AAA epic project, but you could do some really, really nice stuff. So I'm looking forward to returning to a smaller team. Even in a small team with a small scale game, you still want the high level of quality. So there's still going to be sound design, voice, and music, and a final mix and implementation. And I want that vision to be something that's mine, and I work with the creative director and the technical director to really pull it off. So at some point, if it becomes too much, if the content is too much, that's when I can hire people to help with sound design or hire people to help with music. And I'm predicting at this moment that I haven't stopped working with Mike Salvatore. We're still in business together, and we will be probably doing some work together musically still in the future. Well, I'll give you a quick version on that. I mean, I've always felt like that in games, sound makes it real, music makes you feel, and that's like a little couplet that I say. But the important thing to me is, even when I was doing commercials and film, I would find if I didn't know who the sound designer was, they would be making some great explosion or car crash sound, and I might be composing something that would climax right at the moment of explosion. And so we would have 2 audio things happening simultaneously. And you could only fix that in the mix, and something was going to lose out. But if I was in control of both of those areas, even if I wasn't the sound designer or the composers, but I was directing both parties, I could say, this is going to work better with an explosion. Have the music just give me a little hole there. So it's not like I'm turning something down that compositionally should be climaxing. So you can have the music lead up to something, pay it off with an explosion rather than cymbal crash, and you just have a better mix. You have a better full audio experience. So anyway, that works that way in games. It's a little more complex to actually get that to work out. You have to have real-time mixing in the game that basically you have like an artificial intelligence mixer inside the box that actually is making audio decisions on the fly. And if you can make the rules complex and compelling enough for the artificial intelligent mixer, you can do some really beautiful things. So I'm so happy you asked me about audio director, because here I am on film and I'm going to take credit for inventing the term audio director. Now, that might not be true, but I think it's true. Back in 1996, when I first started talking to the guys in Spokane at Cyan, I realized I had an opportunity in this new field called game audio to sort of redesign how the audio person interfaced with the team. And coming from the movies and commercial business and television, there was no audio director. There's a re-recording mixer, there's a composer, there's sound design departments, there's sound editors. There's all these different roles that are very well defined in film and television. And I always felt, because my father was a director, that the concept of director was the cool place to be. I wanted to be a director. But I wanted to be an audio director. I wanted to convince the game people that when it came to moving molecules through the air, anything coming out of the speakers should be the vision of one person. I will fulfill the creative director's vision, but on the audio side. So let me be the audio director, just like there's an art director, I'll be the audio director. I wasn't able to convince the guys at Riven to do that. I didn't get that gig there, but I was able to convince Bungie to give me that role of audio director. So I'm not sure if audio director is the same in every game company. I've always felt like audio director was a very hands-on, creative, visionary role. So that person should be the one who could at least understand how to get the best performances out of actors, think about how to implement, think about the final mix, be in charge of composition and sound design, and putting a team together that could actually fulfill all of those content areas. But at the end of the day, the way I look at it is, if somebody says, oh, I loved the audio in Halo, I could say, well, look at my team. Look at Mike Salvatore, look at C. Paul Johnson, look at Jay Wineland. I have a great team of audio people. Thank you for this compliment. But if somebody says, wow, I think that audio stinks, I say, well, that was my choice. If you don't like it, it was because I made that decision. So I feel like the audio director is responsible, but shouldn't be necessarily credited with everything, but should be responsible, taking responsibility for what's happened in the audio. And because of that, I think it's a better product. It's one person's vision for the audio. You don't have a composer who's fighting with the sound designer. You don't have the voiceover taking precedence over everything in the mix, because there was a person who's in charge of that's different than the person who's in charge of music. But I think in some of the bigger companies, they started getting in people called audio directors who really spend a lot of time with basically their audio producers. They're sort of overseeing the production and spreadsheets and a whole bunch of stuff like that. That's not my vision of audio director. Okay. Audio director is one of those terms that's thrown around a lot, especially in the game business. And every once in a while I'll say, hey, that didn't exist until I talked about it in '96. And a lot of the guys will say, yeah, I think you might be right. So I don't know if it was simultaneously a position that evolved in several places at the same time. But you still, if you say the word audio director in film, if you go to a film studio and say, who's your audio director? They're going to go, what are you talking about? There is no audio director. Sometimes there's a newer thing that's the last 20 years in film called music supervisors, but they're not audio directors. And usually in a film, the director has the full vision for everything, including the audio, which I've always thought is a bit of a mistake, because film directors that are really visual or really story driven, they just don't know what audio can do. And if they would rely on an audio director the way they rely on an art director, I think a lot of films would have better results.
Yeah, with maybe a few exceptions.
Well, yeah, I mean, the Spielbergs and Lucases, they know how important audio is, and they might as well be audio directors, because they really do great work with audio, or have great people who are in their audio teams that fulfill their audio vision. You know, I probably don't follow fan music as closely as I should, but every once in a while I'll hear something or see something on YouTube that just really strikes me. It just warms my heart, because I never anticipated that people would care about music that I wrote or that Mike and I wrote, and actually want to sort of reinterpret it or make it their own. And it's great to actually get to the point where people are doing that, and it's wonderful to hear. And I sometimes I wish I could say, oh no, that was the wrong note. If you just fix that one note, it'll be what it was. But it's people's interpretation. And the other thing for me is, a lot of times, especially kids or young people, are the diet of what they listen to musically is maybe all electronic or all rap or whatever. And there's enough eclectic approach in our music, from classical and monk chant and big orchestral to electronic and ambient and a lot of other things. And it just gives, I've had enough kids tell me that, they were inspired by the game music we did, that they became music majors and cello majors or vocal majors. And that's just really wonderful. That's a bonus side to this medium that I never expected to happen.